Welcome back everyone. In today's lecture, we'll examine one of the most demanding tests for modern international peace building or conflict, which is the case study of disintegration of Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia during the 1990s, the conflict during the disintegration, and then the post-conflict state building and how conflict resolution was approached at that time. This case study is central to understanding the contemporary conflict resolution, humanitarian intervention, and the evolution of European and transatlantic security institutions. The Yugoslav wars that challenged the European Union's emerging foreign policy structure at that time. It also tested the credibility of the UN and also redefined NATO's post-Cold War role. Now, in this lecture, we'll analyze how institutional stability collapsed, how ethnic nationalism replaced the federal cohesion, and how international actors, including European Union, United Nations, United States, and NATO, moved from mediation to coercive enforcement as a conflict resolution process. This case also illustrates the tension between sovereignty and humanitarian intervention and demonstrate how military force, diplomacy, and institutional reconstruction that interact to produce the Dayton Agreement, which is one of the most important agreement at that time in 1995. Coming to next, the Yugoslav conflict must be situated within the broader geopolitical transformation following the end of the Cold War. For 4 decades, bipolar stability structured European security. Yugoslavia, under that Joseph Tito at that time, maintained a unique position as a non-aligned socialist federation. After his death in 1980 and the collapse of the Soviet influence in Eastern Europe, the institutional glue holding Yugoslavia together as a federal structure that began to dissolve. Now, as noted on this slide, the conflict unfolded during a period of transition from institutionalized West to disintegrating East. The absence of very strong federal institutions and combined with several economic distress intensified the nationalist politics. The political elite in several republics mobilized ethnic identity as a strategic resource. Serbian leader at that time particularly used nationalist rhetoric to consolidate power, undermining the federal arrangements. Scholars such as Woodward and Mary Calder, they argue that this period represented not merely a resurgence of ancient ethnic hatred, but rather the breakdown of institutional mechanisms that had previously proved effective in conflict resolution. Nationalism became instrumental by political actors. As the federal structure was breaking down, nationalism became one of the instruments for the political actors at that time to seek authority within the newly uncertain political structure. If you want to theorize the issues that was happening at Yugoslavia at that time, the crisis forced a re-evaluation of the principle of non-intervention, which is enshrined in the UN Charter. Traditionally, the Australian model of sovereignty emphasized that non-interference in domestic affairs is the supreme, as one of the main Australian treaty point. However, as violence escalated and ethnic cleansing became systematic, the distinction between internal repression and external aggression that blurred. The liberal theorists argued that the authoritarian internal practices could generate regional stability. The conflict in Bosnia, in particular, demonstrated that the domestic human rights abuses could threaten the international peace and security. The debate laid intellectual groundwork for what was later evolved into the responsibility to protect doctrine. The Yugoslav wars thus sparked a national movement in international law and normative practices. The international community struggled to reconcile sovereignty with humanitarian protection. The inability of early diplomatic efforts to prevent the atrocities exposed the limitation of strict non-intervention in cases of mass violence. Now, if you see how the conflict was outbroke, on June 1991, Slovenia and Croatia declared their independence. Now, Slovenia's 10-day war was brief because it lacked the substantial Serbian minority and held limited strategic value for Belgrade. A ceasefire was rapidly negotiated, whereas in Croatia contained significant Serb population in regions such as Krajina. The Yugoslav People's Army, or JNA, they increasingly aligning or supporting the Serbian leadership and intervened. What began as the secessionist conflict that evolved into armed confrontation between the Croatian force and the Serb militias supported by the federal military structure. The divergent outcomes in Slovenia and Croatia demonstrate that the importance of ethnic demography in shaping conflict trajectories. Where inter-ethnic entanglement was limited, violence remained short-lived, and where communities were intermixed, warfare intensified and became very protracted at that time. If you see the Bosnia and Herzegovina scene by 1992, the crisis expanded into Bosnia and Herzegovina, the most ethnically heterogeneous republic at that time, home to Bosniak Muslims, Croats and Serbs. The erosion of trinational parity then destroyed the fragile inter-community cooperation that existed. Bosnia's independence referendum triggered the armed resistance from Bosnian Serb forces seeking territorial autonomy. The war in Bosnia becomes synonymous with ethnic cleansing, the ensues warfare and atrocities such as those that later prosecuted by the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, that is ICTY. The conflict revealed that the weakness of early European community recognition policies and demonstrated that the diplomatic recognition without enforcement mechanism could increasingly increase the instability. A core dispute concerned whether Yugoslavia's internal federal borders should become international borders. This was one of the main points of the crisis that Yugoslavia was going through at that time. The international community largely eroded the principle that existing internal administrative lines would form the basic of new states. Now, this approach, supported by the Badinter Arbitration Commission, they prioritized the territorial integrity over ethnic self-determination. The alternative, redrawing borders according to ethnic composition, that risks the triggering, the cascading claims across Europe. By insisting on territory, the European Union and United Nations attempted to stabilize the region, though this decision left many minorities dissatisfied. The border issue highlights the fundamental tension in international law between self-determination and territorial integrity, which should be prioritized in a conflict of such nature. Now, coming to next, at that time of Yugoslav crisis, the European Union's foreign policy capacity was underdeveloped. It was the time that post-conflict or post-Cold War, Europe was just reviving from that, and its foreign policy was still developing. The European political cooperation also functioned as an intergovernmental mechanism with limited operational capability. The treaty's common foreign and security policy had just been established but lacked centralized command structures. The EU sought to demonstrate that Europe could manage its own security challenges. However, internal divisions and lack of military capacity that constrained the effectiveness or effectively implementing the principle. The Yugoslav wars also exposed the structural weakness in European crisis management mechanisms. Coming to the next, Germany's early push to recognize Slovenia and Croatia in late 1991 remains controversial. The critics argue that the premature recognition occurred before minority protections were secured, undermining prospects for negotiated settlement. The Badinter Commission recommended that the conditional recognition ties to human rights guaranteed, yet political momentum overtook caution. Some scholars also view the early recognition as a strategic error that accelerated the fragmentation. Others contend that the recognition merely acknowledged irreversible realities. Now, this debate reflects a broader disagreement about sequencing in conflict resolution, whether legal recognition stabilizes or destabilizes contested territories. Now, coming to the next, the negative integration maybe. Despite shortcomings, the European Union, the institutional structures prevented major European powers from reverting to competitive nationalist policies. Now, this phenomena has been described as negative integration, meaning the participation in European institutions refrained unilateral foreign policy moves by France, Britain, and Germany. The Yugoslav case therefore demonstrates both failure and partial success. While unable to prevent war, the European Union did prevent a wider European confrontation. Institutionalized coordination reduced the risk of interstate escalation among major powers. Now we see the phase 1 and phase 2, probably from the optimism to fragmentation. In the phase 1, the diplomatic optimism prevailed. The European Troika negotiated the Brioni Accord in 1991 and temporarily suspended the independence declarations. However, by phase 2, centrifugal forces dominated. Member states pursued divergent national strategies. Italy and Greece, for example, they followed the policies shaped by the regional interests. The shift from collective coordination to fragmented diplomacy that weakened the European leverage. Now, local actors, they exploited the divisions among mediators. Conflict resolution requires coherence among external actors. Now, Yugoslavia revealed that the consequences of its absence. The absence of the cohesion was one of the main issues of the conflict at that time. Now, coming to the next, multiple mediators that attempted the settlement, including Lord Carrington and David Wynne. They represented European efforts, and Cyrus Vance and Thorvald representing the UN initiatives. Now, peace maps proposing ethnic cantons were repeatedly rejected. Sanctions and economic inducements were deployed as leverage. However, scholars such as Richard Holbrooke then later noted that the diplomatic blueprints lacked enforcement credibility. Without enforcement credibility, the shift in battlefield dynamics, warring parties had little incentive to compromise. Coming to the next phase, that is phase 3 and phase 4, by 1995, the frustration with diplomatic stalemate intensified. The UN Safe Areas policy, designed to protect the civilians in enclave Serbia, proved tragically ineffective. The fall of Serbia in July 1995 and subsequent massacre exposed the limitations of lightly armed peacekeepers operating without robust mandates. In response, NATO's air power was deployed more decisively in Operation Deliberate Force. Now, coordinated US diplomacy under Richard Holbrooke combined coercive pressure with negotiation. This marked a shift from the traditional peacekeeping to peace enforcement. Now, coming to the Dayton's Agreement in 1995, US-sponsored negotiations at Reed-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio, produced the General Framework Agreement for Peace in Bosnia and Herzegovina. The accord created a complex state composed of two entities, the Bosnia and the Croat Federation, and the Republic Srpska. The agreement prevented Bosnia as a single sovereign state while institutionalizing power sharing. NATO-led implementation force ensured the compliance of the same. Dayton ended large-scale violence but produced a highly decentralized political system that remains, administratively complex. It also illustrates a central dilemma of conflict resolution, These agreements often freeze conflict lines rather than resolve underlying grievances. Nevertheless, it achieved the immediate objective of halting the war or peacekeeping. Coming to the regional player, what was the role of Greece and Turkey? The regional dynamic shaped the broader diplomatic environment. Greece often acted as a diplomatic broker with Serbia, while simultaneously pursuing its own interests regarding the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. Turkey sought to expand influence among Muslim communities in Bosnia. Now, this interaction demonstrates that the conflict resolution occurs within overlapping regional rivalries. External actors rarely operate in isolation from their strategic calculus. Coming to the end, the Yugoslav case underscores the difficulty of managing, integrating, or disintegrating regions. Institutional collapse, nationalist mobilizations, and fragmented mediation creates a volatile environment. While the EU's early performance was widely criticized, the broader international response ultimately prevented wider European war, and it also established a new precedent in humanitarian intervention. Key lessons also include the importance of unified external diplomacy, credible enforcement mechanism, and sequencing between recognition and institutional safeguards. The conflict also contributed to the evolution of NATO's role and to the debate that later shaped the responsibility to protect the doctrine. The legacy that the Yugoslavia remains central to peace and conflict studies. Uh, it is also a very good case study of how post-conflict peace building was initiated in this case. It highlights the persistent gap between diplomatic norms and military enforcement, between sovereignty and protection, and between immediate conflict transformation and long-term institutional reconstruction through peace building. The case of former Yugoslavia illustrates that the conflict resolution is rarely linear. It involves negotiation, coercion, institutional rebuilding, and regional diplomacy operating simultaneously. Now, understanding this case provides critical insight into contemporary international crisis management and the evolving architecture of global governance, and how probably the nature of conflict and eventually the peace process is also changing over the time. With this, we come to the end of this lecture. Thank you for your attention.